Good morning. Yeah, it's Christmas week. We're having a great week already. It's already been a wild ride. There's no doubt about that. And this is The Take, by the way. I'm Pete Najarian for Market Rebellion. And I'll tell you, when you look back to this week already and you look at Monday, it feels like it's already been a couple of weeks just in a couple of days, because on Monday we had that roller coaster ride. Market was all over the place. It screamed off of the lows early on after we were down 400 points on the Dow, screamed back to the upside. And yesterday, an interesting market once again, and a little bit of a divergence once again. And so we had a little bit of pressure on the markets yesterday, down, opened down about 150 points or so. And we finished down close to 200 points, or right around that 200 points to the downside on the Dow. But you take a look over at the NASDAQ and suddenly you see a completely different picture. NASDAQ didn't look at all like the Dow throughout most of the session and had a pretty nice close, actually being up about 65 points. And so again, we start seeing some of this movement, some of this push and pull. By the way, yep, and I always say this, but any Q&A you want, just pop it in there and we'll get to that towards the end. So no doubt about it, we'll try to do as best I can to answer as many questions as I can. And by the way, we're not going to be doing the take tomorrow. We're going to take a little bit of a break as we get towards these holidays, just so you know a little ahead of time. So anyway, the interesting part is how the S&P literally just split the markets in terms of the NASDAQ and the Dow, and it finished relatively flat. So, the markets, they're difficult to determine exactly what's going to be the news headline that moves things. There are news headlines each and every day, multiple news headlines, but what are going to be the ones that actually move and shift the markets around? And obviously yesterday, the NASDAQ being the beneficiary of some of the movement and some of the stories that were out yesterday. So we had a volatility index that's still hanging around towards that 24 level. We were bouncing between 23 and 25 yesterday. What was really dragging on the markets, energy, financials, and that it was pretty straightforward. We had technology, which actually closed to the upside by about 1%, hence that move that you're seeing over in the NASDAQ. But on the other side of things, we look at the S&P and you look at the Dow, and certainly energy being a factor, but those financials as well. Financials down about 1%, energy down about 1.5%. Now we've had a roller coaster ride, obviously, in energy over the last couple of weeks, actually call it a couple of months on this moves, mostly to the upside, but obviously we've had some pausing and some pullbacks in energy as well. As a matter of fact, yesterday, energy down 1.7%. It's going to be a little bit of a different story today, and we'll be talking about that in just a second. So some of the leaders yesterday in the NASDAQ, you had Peloton that was up 11%. You had Workday, PayPal, Apple. Apple's been a beast of late, and a lot of the different news stories connected with Apple. And one of them, the most recent one, is about the getting involved in the electric vehicle market, which is a very powerful thing and something that we've been talking about for a while. And some of the acquisitions over the last few years certainly were pointing in that direction. So the reality was everybody looked to Tim Cook saying, hey, when's this going to happen? Well, they've announced it and it's going to happen. So that's something that I think will accelerate out into the future, as well as Apple now has released. They probably didn't want to release it until they really had themselves into the position that they are probably now in terms of getting into this market. And we see it as it's absolutely exploding to the upside. And we see it all the time. We talk about some of these names on a fairly regular basis, and a lot of those names being the Chinese EV makers, as well as what we're seeing here in the United States as we see the Ford F-150 and that new model that's coming out and all the rest of it. So obviously that's going to be a really, really hot space for a while now, I think. So we did have a little bit of a pullback in some of the biotech. The indexes don't really reflect some of the movements to the downside yesterday, but Moderna and Amgen and Gilead and those names were pulling on the markets a little bit. The cruise ships, the airlines, definitely pulling on the markets as well yesterday to some degree, getting hit, but still a monster volume day. Once again, we hit about 34.5 million contracts yesterday. So we continue this pace, this unbelievable pace in terms of where our volumes are right now. This is not just a Robinhood thing. And I bring this up all the time because it has been something that I think has become part of the fabric of what we are seeing, especially in the markets when we were shut down, but also even in sort of more closely looking at even the hybrid markets. And we've seen some shutdown obviously coming again, but the combination of all of that, we are seeing more and more and more in the derivatives markets. And that just continues on today. As a matter of fact, in this first hour of trade, when the first 40 minutes of the day, we already had 11 different hits on the unusual option activity that we have on the Market Rebellion site. I didn't keep up with where we are right when we started at the first hour, but that gives you a little idea of just how active it is. So if we actually get somewhere close to 15 in the first hour, which is probably pretty accurate, I can only imagine what today's going to look like. And I would say that based upon some of the volumes I'm already seeing, we're in for probably another 30 plus million contract day once again. So that certainly is something that's playing into things. So we finally get this stimulus bill. That should be a relief, but it's something that's been going on and on and on. And now you get the concerns, would it get potentially vetoed? So even though we're getting the news, we don't really have a very clear picture of the news that we're getting that's affecting the markets. And that's obviously something that's very, very challenging. So the markets were flat early on in the pre-market, sort of green, but relatively flat. That did not last too terribly long as we were looking over at some of what's going on with the NASDAQ, but we did see now that reverse picture that I was talking about. The NASDAQ's now down, call it 41 points. Last I looked, it was early on, down about 41 points. It's recovered a little bit. Actually, I just saw it go by down about 10, but I look over at the Dow and this tremendous move to the upside. Now we started relatively flat and then we started to move a little bit in the pre-markets up about 80 points, which is not a huge move anymore based upon where the markets are with 30 plus thousand on the Dow. But that went from 80, then suddenly we're up 160, then we're up over 200 points. And the last I had looked, we were up about 150 points and we'll maybe catch up on that. But the stocks that were getting hit, despite the fact that we are seeing some of this movement in the Dow and a little bit of that negative movement we were talking about in the NASDAQ, but you've got Moderna, you've got Zoom, you've got Tesla pulling to the downside. Moderna is all over the place. This is a name that on a day-to-day basis, the movements are absolutely enormous. And today, the pullback, 6.5%. And then you get Zoom down about 5%, Tesla down about 2%, and you get a pretty decent influence on what we are looking at in some of what's going on with the NASDAQ. So energy and financials rocketing today to the upside. Absolutely powerful move and opposite exactly of yesterday. So materials also trading pretty well, but energy was up last I looked about 1.6% or so. A lot of those beta names really fueling that. We looked over at the financials. That was up about 1%. And across the board, when you look at the financials, you look at Goldman Sachs, American Express, JP Morgan, Capital One, US Bank, Morgan Stanley, all of those names really ramping up to the upside in a pretty strong way. Also, take a look over at some of those beta names that we talk about all the time when we talk about what's going on with energy. And Occidental certainly stands out, Diamondback, Marathon, Apache, Hess, a lot of these various names moving to the upside in a big way. 4% moves, 5% moves. Really, really strong, powerful move today from energies. Like I say, it's been bouncing around. It's been very volatile. The general move has been to the upside, but we have days like yesterday where you have that pullback as well. So the movement has been there and it's been very strong. I look over at the volatility index. The last chance I had to look at it, we actually were pulling back again. We were back under 23. We're down about 5% from where we closed yesterday. So we're watching that volatility as we spiked earlier when we'd gotten up over that or near that 29 level. And now we're steadily kind of pulling back. And obviously we've got trade tomorrow, Christmas Eve, some expiration, and obviously Friday we will be closed. So we've got ourselves a long weekend in front of us for the holidays. So that'll be great. Unusual option activity, Goldman Sachs. This one stood out. There were so many that stood out today that was going to be difficult, but I went with Goldman. And the reason I did was because I was looking at what we just were talking about with these financials and the powerful move to the upside. And we've already seen some activity this week in Goldman and expecting maybe a move that could be a very, very rapid move to the upside with the previous paper. Now you get a little bit more time. They're looking at the January calls, January 8th expiring calls in Goldman Sachs, and it's the 260 strike out in January. About 3,700 of those were bought, and they were bought between $3.20 and $4.20. Stock was trading just above $254 at the time. So it would not take a lot for this to move to the upside, but it's going to take something. We had some push lately. We've seen Goldman have some really nice moves. Yesterday, a little bit of a pullback. Today, a little bit stronger. So we'll see if this is a name that can push up and push and break through there. I personally have looked at Goldman. I own some calls already in Goldman. I sort of am looking at the financials with a much more bullish tone, and I think that there's going to be more upside, and specifically in names like Goldman and Morgan Stanley, maybe even more so than some of the money center banks with J.P. Morgan and Bank of America and Citi. So we'll see how that plays out. That's just my opinion right now, but we are seeing some of that paper and some of those flows that we've seen that are coming into Goldman Sachs. So we've got a couple of questions real quick. Morning, Pete. Still in Riot? Yeah, I'm still in Riot. We've seen continuous paper in Riot, and that area has been very, very hot. Anything connected with the Bitcoin world or the cryptocurrency just has been on fire. And obviously Bitcoin has been absolutely an explosive move to the upside as we've been watching that. So really interesting. What do you think of the Moderna with this recent pullback? I think that the problem oftentimes is that you start to look at some of these companies that are directly moving because of COVID. And you just wonder, well, at what point in time do we start to slow down on some of that and maybe look at the rest of the company? It doesn't matter which company we're talking about, whether it's in the biotech world or in the healthcare world or in the healthy world like the Pelotons. You just wonder, when does that slow down? When does that pull back? And when do you start to see some of these names and people start to look at where they are trading from a valuation perspective and looking at the financials? What is their debt? All of those start to become a lot more in focus as you start to lose the focus on what's going on in front of us right now, as that starts to maybe pull back. When you look at what Pfizer's news was today, and they're talking about 200 million doses for vaccines, it's a big number, and it could be very, very impactful. So something that we're always monitoring, of course, because of this pandemic and everything else. So Merry Christmas to all. Appreciate that. Christy, I can't tell enough. I'm totally with you. Weird year, 2020. There have been some positives that have come out of it, but there's so many negatives and so much frustration and mental health and everything that's been going on. That certainly, I want to wish everybody a happy holidays and Merry Christmas wherever you are and whatever your faith may be. Let's see. Thoughts on these December 30 XLF, okay, and some of the, yeah. I trade those pretty rapidly, and I bring that up all the time. When I'm looking at ETFs, anytime I see ETFs that are hitting, or I get involved specifically with these ETFs, if I get gains or losses really early, I am going to move. I'm going to cut my losses early, and I probably won't be as patient with my gains because they're an ETF, and because the movement oftentimes is completely different than when you've got the individual name, which is why I prefer to trade individual names. You hear people all the time. I think in some ways it's almost a little bit lazy, those that are just doing the ETFs, unless they have no ability to be in front of the markets on a daily basis, then it makes much more sense. But I think for the people that want to be a little bit more aggressive trading in the markets, I think individual names are the way to go, and you get directly what you want, because otherwise oftentimes on ETFs it's a little bit different. But in any case, I am very, very short-lived and short period of time where I'm in those ETFs, and I am in right now, I believe, one ETF out of all my disclosures that I've got. Pete, do you still like Vale? Yes, I do. EEM? Yes, I do. I think the potential, and that's ETF, but that way I've got myself some exposure, because I'm not as crazy about a lot of the individual names in some of the rest of the world. I've got positions in some, certainly, but generally with the EEM, you do get obviously emerging markets. But if you look at it very closely, do understand, you get emerging markets, you're getting a heck of a lot of China. So that play is more of a China play than it is the emerging markets, which is it is allegedly represented. So just keep that in mind. Very, very tilted towards a lot of those various names in China. So just keep an eye on that. Do you like Bank of America? Here, I do. I've owned the stock for an extremely long period of time. When I say something like that, multiple years, many years, I've been in Bank of America, selling calls against that for a long period of time. But yeah, I like where it's going. And we were just talking about the financials, and I talked about my focus more on Goldman and Morgan. That doesn't mean that I have lost faith. I own JP Morgan, I own Bank of America. So, but those are much better from a buy right perspective. And I much more often am trading the Goldmans and the Morgans using options and so forth. So just to give you a little up, how would you play Tesla? I think the only way to play Tesla has always been the same. And it's not a bad thing, but I think it's because it's so volatile, because at any moment in time, you could have a move to the upside, to the extreme, or the downside. I think the options are the best way to play it, in my opinion. And when I say that, I think through spreading, you've got incredibly high premiums. And part of that is because of where the stock price is. The other part of it is you've got some implied volatilities that are relatively high. I like to spread off oftentimes. So if I'm looking more on the bullish side, I'm buying a call and I'm selling a higher strike call against it. And on the downside, same thing. And I do trade both the upside and the downside with a bias, depending on what we have seen in the unusual options that our great guys do a magnificent job posting all day long. I'll tell you what, Chris Sikora and Mikey and Brian McCormick, who is the chart guru for us at Market Rebellion, that combination of those three and what they're able to accomplish at the end of each and every day is absolutely unbelievable. So I just want to put thoughts on Vale. I just talked about that a second ago. Still thinking, I still believe in the material space. And we've had paper. And when I say paper, unusual option hits time after time after time after time. So yes, I still believe in that name. Are you out of FUBO? I am. Great run. It's been an unbelievable play. That thing moved. It's amazing talking to a lot of different people who have owned it at different times and just where they owned it and got out and they're frustrated. Tell you what, if you make money on a trade, don't be frustrated. Do not be frustrated, because you'll kick yourself all the time. And it's always easy to second guess, but when you're taking some profits, that's never a bad thing. So always remember that. Thoughts on AMD? Thanks, Pete. Happy holidays. Right back at you, Sal. I'll tell you what, AMD, that option paper has been banging, it seems like, for the last month or more, and it almost feels like an everyday thing. And it's close to that, but it's not every day, but very, very close to that. I still think at some point in time, we're going to see this blow through the upside. And the SMH, as you all know, if you take a look at the semiconductor index, you'll see that has pulled back and paused, very much like the XLK did. It had pulled back and paused. Now the XLK, the technology index, continues to hit new highs. The SMH is off of those highs. I think those are healthy pauses and pullbacks when we see those in the market. And so looking at the semiconductor area right now, I have a lot of exposure in there. So I'm a believer that there's still going to be some upside, but I also am a believer that I think from a healthy perspective, that's what stocks tend to do. So that's my personal opinion. And I think I'd love to talk with Brian McCormick and some of our other chart gurus about that as well. Pete, this is going to have to be my last one because I got to run. And I know you guys are all busy. We got a busy day. We got a busy weekend. We got obviously holidays and everybody's got a lot going on. Morning, Pete. Thoughts and names on EV charging status? I'll tell you what, that space is on fire. And when I say that, it doesn't necessarily mean every single stock is going to go up. But I will say that the electronic vehicle space, whether you're talking about the batteries, the vehicles themselves, it is absolutely on fire. Let's not forget that their chips are also very heavily involved in this area as well. There are so many different arms and legs to this whole thing, but I think you just have to do your research. We know what option paper we see on a daily basis and so many different names. Do I ever get concerns about some of these? Because I hear this commentary a lot. Hey, this company, Pete, is not right. I think it's a fraud, blah, 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 all of those kinds of things. These are trades, and there's a lot of reasons why you don't see me very often owning stock in some of these names. As a matter of fact, I've been burned myself, so I'm much more apt when they're especially a foreign name to be in the options. I'll be there because I know exactly my risk parameters, my risk and reward, and if I'm long something, I can only lose what I paid. It's a lot different when you're trading the stocks because that's a much different piece of information for when things actually go negative. Now, all of a sudden, it's a very complicated situation. And I had a position like that in Luckin Coffee not too terribly long ago that was frustrating. The only good part about that was I'd sold calls against that position for many, many months, and it helped reduce some of the pain. It didn't reduce all the pain. But that's sort of what prompted me to be, all right, I'm back into what I always talked about, which is there are certain areas in the marketplace. I think the EV space is one of them, and a lot of foreign countries as well, where I am not long the stocks, but I will trade those options because I absolutely know my risk reward. So hopefully that gives you your answer. Folks, have a great day of trading. It's been a really, really fun last couple of days. I'm sure today is going to continue to be wild. It's already been a bit of a wild ride as we've watched things moving around and everything else. But be safe, be smart, understand the derivatives markets, and we will see you very soon. I'll see you next Monday.